No one in that prison could explain how a woman locked away from the world could become pregnant, and that was exactly what made the discovery feel less like a mistake and more like the beginning of a buried nightmare. In the dead of winter, inside a maximum security prison in northern Pennsylvania, a condemned woman collapsed on the concrete floor of a solitary cell that had been watched, logged, sealed, and monitored with obsessive precision. Within minutes, alarms moved through the corridor, boots pounded across the steel walkway, and the medical unit rushed to a place where nothing unusual was ever supposed to happen. What they found inside her body would shake every officer, every supervisor, and every person who had ever trusted that walls, cameras, and procedure could control everything. She was nearly 20 weeks pregnant. The woman now known in prison records as Maren Vale had not touched freedom in years. She was 34, sentenced after a drug trafficking conviction that had ended what once looked like a brilliant life. Before prison, she had been the kind of woman people pointed to as proof that discipline could change destiny. She had grown up in Erie, Pennsylvania, in a house where achievement mattered more than comfort, where schedules were respected, mistakes were remembered, and success was treated like the only safe road out of hardship. Maren followed that road with relentless focus. She studied harder than everyone around her, earned scholarships, entered pharmaceutical science, and built the kind of career that impressed people without her having to ask for attention. She taught, published, and carried herself with the calm confidence of someone who believed life could still be controlled by logic. Then life cracked open in the ugliest way possible. A fast marriage, a husband with hidden debt, reckless promises, and financial collapse dragged her out of that world piece by piece. What began as sacrifice turned into ruin. By the time she realized how badly she had been deceived, the money was gone, the trust was gone, and the man she had gambled everything for had vanished. Desperation does not always arrive screaming. Sometimes it arrives quietly, dressed as one practical decision. One favor. One trip. One package. One lie accepted because the alternative feels worse. Maren took that path once, and once was enough to destroy the rest of her life. After sentencing, she was transferred into a restricted isolation wing reserved for the most tightly controlled inmates. Her cell was not just locked, it was managed like a machine. Reinforced steel, double security checks, scheduled food delivery, female staff rotations, medical oversight, camera coverage, and movement logs reduced every hour of her existence to procedure. She had no social life, no visits, no real privacy, and no room left for personal mystery. She became a figure people mentioned in clipped professional language. Stable. Quiet. Cooperative. Emotionally contained. No incidents. No outbursts. No requests. She ate on time, cleaned her space, followed instructions, and seemed to shrink deeper into silence with each passing month. To the prison, she was not a person with a future. She was a body waiting for the state to decide when its final order would be carried out. Yet something had changed long before anyone noticed. On that night, the air in the block felt dead and metallic, the kind of cold that sinks into concrete and never leaves. The fluorescent lights hummed above the corridor. Security monitors glowed in the control room. Officers moved through their rounds with the numb discipline that comes from repetition. Maren had been visible on camera, sitting against the wall of her cell, shoulders slightly curved, one hand drifting again and again toward her lower abdomen in a gesture subtle enough to mean nothing at the time. She did not call for help. She did not bang on the door. She did not draw attention to herself. Then, just before midnight, her body gave out. She rose unsteadily, took a step, and dropped hard onto the cell floor. Emergency response came fast. The door was opened under protocol, her condition assessed, and she was rushed to the prison infirmary. At first, staff suspected internal bleeding from the fall. Her pulse was weak. Her lips were pale. The attending physician began scanning for trauma and found something that made the room go silent. There, on the ultrasound screen, undeniable and alive, was a developing fetus. Not a recent conception. Not an uncertain shadow. A pregnancy already well underway. The heartbeat was strong. The growth measurements were clear. The truth was sitting in plain view, impossible to argue with and impossible to explain. Shock inside a prison does not look theatrical. It looks like people going still. It looks like trained professionals checking the same result again because their minds refuse the first one. It looks like clipped voices becoming lower, slower, tighter. By dawn, the matter had already moved beyond medicine and become a full institutional threat. Supervisors were pulled in. Records were locked down. Security footage was ordered. Internal review began before sunrise. The question spread through the chain of command with terrifying speed. How could an isolated female inmate become pregnant without physical access to any man? Every answer seemed impossible. If a male staff member had entered, the logs should show it. If an officer had violated protocol, cameras should reveal it. If contraband or outside assistance had been involved, there should have been traces, signs, gaps, something. But the cell had been maintained under strict conditions. Meal delivery was controlled. Medical contact was limited. Access to her wing was restricted. No approved visitation could account for it. No official pathway existed. The prison's confidence in its own system began to crack the moment that pregnancy was confirmed, because if this could happen here, then something inside the structure was already broken. Maren regained consciousness later, exhausted but composed in a way that disturbed everyone around her. She did not react like someone shocked by sudden news. She looked like someone who had been carrying a secret for a very long time and had finally reached the moment when it could no longer stay hidden. That calm unsettled the staff more than panic would have. Panic could be managed. Calm suggested planning. It suggested intent. It suggested that while everyone else believed they were watching a woman slowly disappear behind prison walls, she had been moving toward something in silence, step by step, inside the most impossible place imaginable. By mid-morning, the prison was no longer treating the situation as a medical anomaly. It had become a crisis. Officers who had worked that wing were quietly scrutinized. Surveillance teams began pulling archives. Maintenance logs, medication requests, incident reports, and staffing rosters were re-examined. People stopped trusting appearances. Innocent routines suddenly looked suspicious. A vitamin request from weeks earlier seemed strange. A momentary camera blind angle became significant. An ordinary maintenance detail now felt dangerous. The prison had not merely discovered a pregnancy. It had discovered proof that human intention could survive under conditions designed to crush it. And at the center of it all sat Maren Vale, a condemned woman who had lived like a ghost behind concrete and steel, now carrying the one thing no prison had expected to find inside her, a future. Not freedom. Not rescue. A child. That was the moment the prison stopped asking whether the pregnancy was real and started chasing a far darker question. If no one had touched her, then how had she done it? And if she had not done it alone, who had been close enough to help a woman on death row create life in the middle of a place built entirely around control? That answer was still buried. But from that night on, every locked door in the prison felt less secure, every camera less certain, and every silence around cell 17 began to sound like it was hiding something alive. Long before the prison became obsessed with the impossible pregnancy, Maren Vale had already lived two completely different lives, and the distance between them was the real story no one inside those walls fully understood. She had not always been a silent figure behind reinforced steel. There was a time when her name carried weight in lecture halls, when her presence meant discipline, intelligence, and control. She had been the kind of woman who built her future carefully, step by step, believing that precision and effort could prevent chaos. That belief would later become the very thing that broke her. She grew up in a modest suburb outside Erie, Pennsylvania, in a household where expectations were clear and unforgiving. Her parents were not wealthy, but they were relentless about structure. Mistakes were corrected immediately, emotions were kept in check, and success was treated as the only acceptable outcome. Maren adapted to that world early. She learned to stay focused, to suppress distraction, and to measure her worth through results. By the time she reached high school, she had already separated herself from her peers, not because she was different by nature, but because she refused to allow herself to fail. That discipline carried her into college, where she entered pharmaceutical science with near-perfect scores. While others drifted between uncertainty and experimentation, Maren stayed on a straight path. She studied longer, worked harder, and pushed herself into research early. Her professors noticed. Opportunities followed. She became involved in projects studying drug interactions and treatment development, earning recognition that most students could not reach at her age. By her late 20s, she had secured a teaching position, standing in front of classrooms where students looked at her as proof that success could be engineered. But success built on control has one fatal weakness. It cannot survive chaos. The turning point did not arrive dramatically. It came quietly, through someone who appeared to fit perfectly into the life she had constructed. His name was Calder Reese, a man older than her, confident, composed, and outwardly successful in import-export logistics. He entered her life at a time when everything seemed stable, when her career was advancing and her future looked predictable. He brought something she had never allowed herself to prioritize before: emotion, attention, and the illusion of balance between work and life. Maren did not fall recklessly. She calculated, observed, and convinced herself that this relationship made sense. Calder presented himself as reliable, ambitious, and capable. He knew how to speak, how to appear trustworthy, how to make stability feel shared rather than solitary. Within a year, they married. For the first time in her life, Maren stepped away from strict control, believing she had finally reached a point where she could afford to. That decision unraveled everything. The truth surfaced slowly at first, then all at once. Calder was not the man he had presented himself to be. Behind the polished surface were debts, hidden losses, and a pattern of risk that bordered on addiction. Investments had failed. Gambling had escalated. Financial pressure had been concealed behind confidence and charm. By the time Maren realized the extent of it, the damage was already beyond repair. She did not react with anger. She reacted with the same logic that had guided her entire life. Problems were meant to be solved. She sold her apartment in Pittsburgh, liquidated her savings, and used everything she had to cover his debts, believing that once the burden was removed, stability could return. It was a calculated sacrifice, one she made without hesitation, because she still believed that effort could fix what was broken. What she did not understand was that she was the only one trying to fix anything. Calder disappeared within months. No warning, no explanation, no attempt to rebuild. He vanished, leaving behind nothing but silence and the remains of a life Maren had already dismantled to save him. The financial collapse was complete. The career she had stepped away from no longer had a place for her. The stability she had built over years had been traded for something that no longer existed. For the first time in her life, Maren faced a situation she could not control, could not reverse, and could not solve through discipline alone. Desperation changed the way she made decisions. It did not transform her into someone reckless overnight. It eroded her judgment slowly, making compromises feel reasonable, temporary, and necessary. She began working small jobs, tutoring, consulting, anything that could generate income. But the gap between what she needed and what she had became impossible to ignore. That was when opportunity appeared again, this time wearing a different mask. It came through an acquaintance, someone from her past who knew enough about her situation to approach her at exactly the right moment. The offer was simple, almost insultingly easy. A quick trip, a controlled delivery, no risk, no questions. The explanation was clean. The compensation was high. The timing was perfect. It was presented not as a crime, but as a solution. Maren hesitated, but not for long. She justified it the same way she had justified everything else. One time. One correction. One step to regain stability. She told herself she was still in control, that she understood the risks, that she could manage the situation. That belief, the same belief that had guided her entire life, was what led her directly into the trap. She was arrested at a checkpoint outside Scranton. The evidence was immediate and undeniable. The package she carried was not what she had been told. The quantity alone guaranteed the most severe outcome. There was no confusion, no misunderstanding, no escape from the legal reality that followed. The system moved quickly. Charges were filed. The case was built. The trial was conducted with efficiency that left no room for ambiguity. Maren did not fight the verdict the way others might have. She did not break down in court. She did not attempt to shift blame. She did not create a defense built on emotion. She accepted the outcome with the same cold logic that had defined her life. The law had spoken, and she understood exactly what it meant. When the sentence was delivered, it did not surprise her. It simply closed the final chapter of the life she had once controlled. From that moment on, she became something else. Transferred into maximum security isolation, she entered a world where time stopped moving forward and instead began repeating itself. Days became identical. Nights became longer. Human contact became procedural. Conversation disappeared. Identity faded. She adapted the only way she knew how, by maintaining structure. She followed rules, maintained routine, and withdrew into silence so complete that even the staff assigned to monitor her struggled to read anything behind her expression. But beneath that silence, something had begun to change. It was not visible at first. There were no sudden shifts, no dramatic behaviors, no signs that would trigger concern. If anything, she appeared even more stable than before. She requested vitamins occasionally, citing fatigue. She ate consistently. She avoided conflict. She did everything expected of her and nothing more. To the system, she was the ideal inmate, predictable, manageable, contained. What no one realized was that Maren had reached a point where survival was no longer about extending her own life. She had stopped thinking about herself in the way the prison expected. She was no longer measuring time in terms of days remaining or outcomes ahead. Instead, she had begun focusing on something else entirely, something that existed beyond her own sentence. The silence she lived in was not empty. It was deliberate. It was controlled. It was hiding intention. By the time she collapsed in that cell months later, the pregnancy was not an accident waiting to be discovered. It was the result of a decision that had been forming long before anyone thought to look for it. And that was what made the situation truly dangerous. Because if Maren Vale had planned something inside a system designed to eliminate possibility, then the prison was no longer dealing with a mystery. It was dealing with proof that even in total isolation, human will could find a way to act. The investigation would soon uncover how. But by then, the truth would be far more unsettling than anyone inside those walls was prepared to accept. The prison did not panic loudly. It tightened. Within hours of confirming the pregnancy, the entire facility shifted into a controlled state of internal scrutiny that felt more suffocating than any alarm. Doors still opened and closed on schedule, meals were still delivered, lights still flickered with the same indifferent rhythm, but underneath that routine, every movement began to carry suspicion. The system that had always been trusted to function without error was now being forced to examine itself, and what it found was not answers, but silence. The investigation began with the only thing the prison believed could not lie: its own records. 60 days of surveillance footage were pulled first, then 90, then extended further back when nothing appeared. Every camera angle covering the restricted wing was reviewed frame by frame. Officers sat for hours in dim control rooms, eyes fixed on screens that replayed the same scenes over and over again. A tray sliding through a slot. A guard walking past a door. A medical check conducted under supervision. Nothing broke protocol. Nothing suggested intrusion. Nothing explained how a woman with zero contact could carry a pregnancy that had already advanced beyond doubt. The logs told the same story. Keycard entries matched scheduled movements. Door access records showed no unauthorized openings. Staff rotations were clean, consistent, and verified. Female-only personnel had been assigned to her unit without exception. Medical visits had been documented with precision. Even the smallest irregularity, something as minor as a delayed meal delivery or an extended inspection, was flagged and rechecked. Each time, the conclusion remained unchanged. The system had not failed in any obvious way. That was what made the situation more dangerous. Because when a system designed to eliminate error produces an impossible result, it forces a new kind of question. One that does not ask what went wrong, but what was never being seen in the first place. Maren Vale became the center of that question. After regaining consciousness, she did not behave like someone caught in an impossible situation. She did not show confusion. She did not demand explanations. She did not attempt to manipulate the narrative or protect herself with denial. Instead, she remained composed, her movements measured, her presence controlled in a way that unsettled even the most experienced staff. There was no panic in her. No visible fear. Only a quiet certainty that suggested she had already accepted everything that was now unfolding. That calm began to spread tension through the facility faster than any confirmed violation could have. People started looking at each other differently. In staff rooms, conversations became shorter, more careful. No one wanted to be the first to suggest misconduct, but no one could ignore the possibility either. Every officer who had worked near her wing found themselves mentally retracing their own actions. Had there been a moment missed? A routine overlooked? A detail dismissed as unimportant? Suspicion did not need evidence to grow. It fed on uncertainty, and uncertainty was now everywhere. The investigation expanded. Medical records were pulled and reviewed again, this time with a different focus. What had once been routine entries now became potential clues. A request for supplements weeks earlier. Complaints of fatigue that had been considered normal under confinement. Small details that had never raised concern now carried weight they had not been designed to hold. The timeline began to form, not from clear evidence, but from fragments that refused to align with logic. Security protocols were reinforced overnight. An additional mobile camera was installed inside Maren's cell, removing even the smallest blind angle. Monitoring was increased to continuous real-time observation. Staff assignments were adjusted to ensure overlapping supervision. Every interaction, no matter how minor, was now documented with heightened scrutiny. The prison was not just watching her anymore. It was watching itself. Still, nothing new appeared. Maren continued her routine as if nothing had changed. She ate. She cleaned. She rested. She moved with the same deliberate calm that had defined her before the discovery. But there was one difference that could no longer be ignored. Her body was no longer a neutral presence within the system. It had become evidence. And evidence demanded explanation. The pressure began to shift toward identifying a human source. The investigation turned toward personnel who had any possible proximity to the restricted wing, even indirectly. Maintenance staff, medical assistants, logistical support teams. Anyone who had operated within structural reach of her cell was brought into review. Not as suspects at first, but as variables. Each one was questioned, their schedules compared, their movements mapped against surveillance data. Most answers were immediate, consistent, and easily verified. Until one name disrupted the pattern. Tobin Krell. He had not entered the women's isolation unit. He had not accessed her cell. He had not appeared on any direct contact log. On paper, he was irrelevant. A low-risk inmate assigned to supervised maintenance tasks, assisting with electrical repairs and facility upkeep. His record inside the prison was clean, compliant, quiet, no disciplinary issues, no flagged behavior. But he had been there. During a maintenance operation months earlier, he had been assigned to a technical corridor running parallel to the restricted wing. The job had been routine, checking electrical lines, clearing minor faults, assisting staff under supervision. It had not triggered concern at the time because there was no reason for it to. His presence had been authorized, documented, and contained within procedural boundaries. Yet now, under the weight of the investigation, that proximity became impossible to ignore. He was brought in for questioning. There was nothing overtly suspicious in his responses. He confirmed his assignment, described his tasks, and maintained that he had no interaction with any inmate from the restricted wing. His tone remained steady, his posture controlled, his answers precise. On the surface, there was no contradiction, no sign of deception that could be easily identified. But there was something else. A hesitation that did not belong to someone entirely detached from the situation. Not fear, not guilt in the obvious sense, but something closer to restraint. As if he were holding back a piece of information not because he was being forced to, but because he had chosen not to reveal it. The investigators noticed. Not enough to accuse, not enough to confirm involvement, but enough to mark him as relevant. His timeline was re-examined. His movement logs were cross-referenced again. The area he had worked in was mapped in detail, this time not as a maintenance zone, but as a potential connection point between two spaces that were never meant to interact. Still, there was no proof. And that was the problem. The prison had reached a point where every logical path had been followed and had led nowhere. The system remained intact on paper. The procedures had not been visibly broken. Yet reality stood in direct contradiction to all of it. Maren was pregnant, and no official record could explain how. The atmosphere inside the facility began to change in a way that was difficult to define but impossible to ignore. Routine continued, but certainty did not. Every locked door now felt less absolute. Every camera less reliable. Every procedure less final. The illusion of complete control had been disrupted, and in its place was something far more unsettling. The realization that something had occurred within the prison that had not been designed, approved, or even imagined by the system that governed it. And at the center of it all, Maren Vale remained silent. Not defensive. Not desperate. Not confused. Silent in a way that suggested she already knew the answer everyone else was still searching for. The investigation had not failed. It had simply not reached the place where the truth was hiding. But that place was closer than anyone realized. And when it was finally uncovered, it would force the prison to confront something far more dangerous than a breach of security. It would force them to confront intention. When the investigation began to stall, the prison stopped looking for violations and started looking for patterns. That shift changed everything. Instead of asking who had entered Maren Vale's cell, the investigators began asking a more dangerous question. What parts of the facility had ever come close enough to her without being considered access at all? The answer was not in the doors. It was in the walls. Blueprints of the prison were pulled from storage and laid out under harsh fluorescent light. Layers of structure, ventilation, wiring channels, and maintenance routes were reviewed in detail that had never been necessary before. What had once been treated as background infrastructure now became potential pathways. The facility was no longer seen as a series of sealed rooms, but as a network of hidden connections running behind them. That was when the ventilation system drew attention. The air ducts connecting different sections of the building had always been considered irrelevant to inmate interaction. They were narrow, reinforced, and inaccessible through standard means. They existed only to circulate air, not to allow movement or communication. No one had ever treated them as a security concern, because they were never designed to be used by anyone. But design and possibility are not the same thing. A technical inspection team was sent to re-examine the ductwork running between the maintenance corridor and the isolation wing. It was a routine step at first, another box to check in an investigation that had already exhausted obvious leads. But as they moved deeper into the system, something changed. One section did not match the rest. The vent opening near the maintenance corridor showed signs of disturbance. Not damage in the sense of forced entry, but subtle alteration. A thin layer of dust had been disrupted in a way that suggested repeated contact. A small piece of fabric, wedged into the edge of the opening, appeared newer than anything around it. It did not belong to the structure. It had been placed there deliberately. The team paused. Careful inspection revealed more. Inside the narrow passage, partially concealed in the darkness, was a thin nylon cord, no longer than 2 meters, wound tightly around a small piece of wood. It was not part of the facility. It was not part of any maintenance equipment. It had been constructed, placed, and used with intent. When the cord was gently pulled free, something else came with it. A small plastic bag, sealed but marked with faint residue, slid out from the far end of the duct. Alongside it, caught in the fabric, was a used syringe, basic, improvised, but unmistakable in purpose. The moment those objects were exposed to the light, the entire investigation shifted. This was no longer a question of whether something had happened. It was a question of how long it had been happening without anyone noticing. The items were immediately secured and sent for analysis. The chain of custody was documented with precision. No one spoke more than necessary. There was no need. The implications were already clear. Whatever had occurred inside that prison had not relied on breaking doors or bypassing cameras. It had used something far simpler, far more dangerous, a blind spot no one had considered worth watching. The results came back quickly. DNA extracted from the residue in the plastic bag matched Tobin Krell. That single confirmation collapsed every remaining doubt. The quiet, compliant inmate who had once worked near that corridor was no longer a peripheral figure in the investigation. He had become the key to everything. Not because he had forced his way into a restricted space, but because he had found a way to reach someone without ever crossing a boundary the system knew how to track. He was brought back in. This time, the room felt different. There was no longer uncertainty about his connection to the case. The evidence had already established it. What remained was understanding the extent of his involvement, the intention behind it, and the method that had turned an impossible situation into reality. Tobin did not react the way the investigators expected. He did not attempt to deny the evidence. He did not collapse under pressure. He did not construct a defensive narrative. Instead, he remained composed in a way that mirrored Maren's own unsettling calm. It was not defiance. It was not indifference. It was something else, something closer to acceptance. The story began to take shape in fragments. During his maintenance assignment months earlier, Tobin had been positioned in the corridor that ran alongside the isolation wing. The walls between them were thick, reinforced, and designed to prevent any form of interaction. But sound does not always respect design. Through the narrow space of the ventilation system, faint noise could travel. A cough. A shift. The smallest sign that someone existed on the other side. That was how it started. Not with a plan, not with intention, but with awareness. Two people, separated by concrete and steel, became aware of each other's presence in a place where presence itself was supposed to be erased. At first, there was nothing more than that, an acknowledgement that another human being existed within reach, even if that reach was limited to something as intangible as sound. Then came the first act of contact. A small piece of paper, folded tightly, pushed through the narrow opening of the vent. It was not meant to travel far. It was not meant to be seen by anyone else. It was an experiment, a question without words, sent into a space where communication was not supposed to exist. It reached its destination. What followed was not immediate, not reckless, not chaotic. It developed slowly, carefully, shaped by caution and necessity. Each exchange was brief, minimal, designed to avoid detection. There were no voices, no direct sight, no physical contact. Only fragments of communication passing through a space no one had thought to monitor. In that space, something began to form. Not a relationship in the way the outside world would define it, but a connection built entirely on isolation, on shared awareness, on the simple fact that neither of them was completely alone anymore. For Maren, whose life had been reduced to silence and waiting, that connection became something else. Not comfort. Not escape. Purpose. The plan did not appear all at once. It emerged from a single idea that refused to disappear. She did not want to live. But she did not want to disappear without leaving something behind. That was the difference. For Tobin, the decision was not logical. It was not safe. It was not something that could be justified within the structure of the prison or the law that governed it. But logic had already failed both of them long before that moment. What remained was something more difficult to define, a response to another human being reaching for something that did not exist anywhere else in that place. The method was crude. There was no medical supervision, no sterile environment, no guarantee of success. Everything had to be improvised. Materials had to be obtained without raising suspicion. Timing had to be precise. Each action had to fit within routines that were already being monitored. The risk was constant. The margin for error was almost non-existent. And yet, they continued. Night after night, through a narrow opening in the wall, using nothing more than what they could hide, pass, and retrieve, they carried out a process that should not have been possible under any controlled system. There was no certainty it would work. No assurance it would lead to anything at all. Only the determination to try, repeated again and again in silence. Until it did. By the time the pregnancy was discovered, the act itself was already complete. The system had not failed in a single moment. It had been bypassed slowly, carefully, over time, through a space no one had ever treated as a threat. When the full truth settled into the investigation room, no one reacted immediately. There was no outburst. No dramatic confrontation. Only a heavy stillness that spread through the space as the reality became impossible to ignore. This had not been an accident. It had not been a lapse in discipline. It had been a deliberate act carried out under conditions designed to prevent exactly that kind of possibility. The prison had not been broken. It had been outthought. And at the center of it all was a decision that none of the protocols had been built to understand. A woman facing the end of her life, choosing to create one instead, and a man who had no reason to help her, choosing to do it anyway. That was the truth the investigation uncovered. And it was only the beginning of what the prison would have to face next. Once the truth surfaced, the prison expected clarity. Instead, it was left with something far more unsettling: the realization that every step had been deliberate, quiet, and driven by a kind of purpose no protocol had ever been designed to confront. What had happened was no longer a mystery of mechanics. It became a question of intention, and intention was far harder to contain. The evidence laid out the method with cold precision. The vent, the cord, the sealed pouch, the improvised syringe. Each piece told a part of the story. But what those objects could not explain was why it had been done with such persistence, such patience, and such complete disregard for consequence. The prison had been prepared to uncover a breach, a weakness, a mistake. It had not been prepared to uncover a decision. Maren Vale had not stumbled into this. She had chosen it. Long before her collapse, long before the investigation began, she had already committed herself to a path that required absolute control over silence, timing, and secrecy. Every action had to align with routine. Every movement had to appear ordinary. Every risk had to be calculated against the certainty of failure if she hesitated. There was no room for error, no space for second thoughts, and no guarantee that any of it would work. And still, she continued. Inside her cell, nothing about her behavior had changed in ways that would alert suspicion. She maintained her schedule, followed instructions, and preserved the same quiet discipline that had defined her from the beginning. But beneath that surface, her focus had shifted entirely. She was no longer existing within the system as a passive subject. She was using the system's predictability as a shield, moving within its expectations so precisely that no one thought to look beyond them. The process itself was fragile, uncertain, and deeply risky. There were no medical safeguards, no professional guidance, no controlled conditions. Everything depended on timing, repetition, and the body's own response. It required endurance, both physical and mental, to continue despite the uncertainty. Each attempt carried the possibility of failure, and failure would not just mean the end of the effort. It would mean exposure, punishment, and the destruction of whatever chance remained. Yet Maren did not stop. Night after night, in a space designed to strip away human connection, she acted with a level of determination that contradicted everything the prison believed about isolation. She was not reacting to her sentence. She was redefining what her final act would be. Not survival. Not escape. Creation. That was what made it impossible for the system to categorize her. She was not seeking advantage in the way the investigation had initially assumed. She did not file appeals. She did not request reconsideration. She did not attempt to use her condition as leverage once it became undeniable. Even when confronted with the reality of what she had done, she did not shift her position. She did not redirect the narrative toward herself. She did not try to transform the situation into a negotiation. She remained focused on one outcome: the child. For the investigators, this was the point where logic began to fracture. Every framework they relied on, motive, gain, risk, reward, failed to align with her actions. There was no clear benefit for her in the traditional sense. The act itself had placed her in greater danger, not less. It had exposed her to scrutiny, to potential punishment, to consequences that extended beyond her original sentence. And still, she had done it. Tobin Krell's role, once fully understood, only deepened the tension surrounding the case. He had not been manipulated. He had not been coerced. There was no evidence of pressure, no indication of exchange or promise. His involvement had been voluntary, measured, and sustained over time. He had acted with awareness of the risk, with full understanding of the rules he was breaking, and with no expectation of protection once the truth emerged. That was what unsettled the investigators most. Two individuals, separated by walls, by law, by circumstance, had aligned in purpose without ever sharing space. Their actions had not been driven by impulse. They had been built slowly, through repetition and restraint, until they produced a result that no one inside the prison had thought possible. The institution responded the only way it could. Security tightened further. The ventilation systems were sealed and reinforced. Access points were restructured. Monitoring protocols were expanded to include areas that had never before been considered vulnerable. Every assumption about control was rewritten. The prison adapted, but adaptation came too late to prevent what had already happened. Because by then, the most critical outcome had already been secured. Maren's pregnancy continued. Medical supervision increased, but not out of leniency. It was necessity. Her condition required monitoring, not because the system had chosen to support her, but because the reality inside her body could no longer be ignored. Each week that passed made the situation more irreversible. Each development of the fetus pushed the case further beyond the point where it could be treated as an anomaly. It became a living consequence. Inside the infirmary, the same staff who had once viewed her as a condemned inmate now found themselves responsible for preserving something entirely different. The shift was subtle but undeniable. Procedures remained strict. Protocols were followed. But the presence of a developing life altered the atmosphere in ways no regulation could fully control. Maren herself did not change. She did not become emotional. She did not seek attention. She did not attempt to draw sympathy from those around her. She remained as she had always been, quiet, controlled, focused. But there was a difference in the way she carried herself, a subtle shift in posture, in movement, in the way her hand would occasionally rest against her abdomen with a certainty that had not been visible before. It was not hope. It was completion. For the prison, the situation had already moved beyond containment. What had begun as an investigation into an impossible event had become something far more complicated. It was no longer just about how the pregnancy had occurred. It was about what it meant for a system built on finality to confront the existence of something that refused to end. Because no matter how the institution responded, no matter how the rules were enforced, one fact could no longer be erased. Inside a place designed to carry out endings, something had begun. And that beginning was moving forward, day by day, beyond anyone's ability to reverse it. By the time the storm arrived, the prison had already accepted that nothing about the case would return to normal. What had started as a sealed system built on certainty was now forced to operate around something it could not undo. Maren Vale's pregnancy had advanced beyond debate, beyond investigation, beyond discipline. It had become a reality the institution had to carry, whether it understood it or not. The night labor began. The weather turned violent. Cold rain hammered the outer walls of the facility, wind cutting through the narrow corridors and rattling every metal surface it could reach. Power fluctuations moved through the grid, forcing backup systems to engage in uneven bursts of light. The prison, usually defined by rigid control, felt unstable in a way that mirrored the tension building inside its walls. Nothing failed completely, but nothing felt secure either. Inside the infirmary, the situation shifted from observation to urgency. Maren's body began to give in to a process that no system could delay or regulate. There was no option to transfer her safely. Conditions outside made transport risky, and the internal protocols that governed her status complicated every decision. The prison was forced into a position it had never prepared for, conducting a birth within the same structure designed to end lives. Everything became immediate. Medical staff moved quickly, adapting to limitations they could not change. Equipment was basic, conditions far from ideal, and time refused to slow down. There was no room for hesitation, no margin for delay. What had been a controlled case file transformed into a moment where instinct and necessity replaced procedure. Maren did not resist what was happening. She endured it with the same controlled intensity that had defined every step of her path. There was no outward display of panic, no loss of focus, no visible collapse under the pressure of what her body was forcing her to face. She remained present, anchored in the moment, as if everything that had led to this point had already prepared her for it. The hours stretched. Pain, exhaustion, and uncertainty compressed into a single, relentless progression. The storm outside did not fade. The lights continued to flicker. The walls of the prison, once symbols of control, now held something far more fragile within them. For the staff present, the roles they had carried for years no longer fit cleanly. They were not just maintaining order. They were witnessing something that stood outside the logic of the system they served. Then, at the breaking point of that tension, it happened. A child was born. The sound cut through everything. It did not belong to the prison. It did not belong to the storm. It did not belong to the system that had defined Maren's existence. It was something entirely separate, something new, something that carried no history of the walls that surrounded it. In that moment, the institution faced something it could not categorize, could not discipline, and could not erase. Life had entered a place built for endings. The infant was small but stable, fragile yet undeniable. Medical staff moved with renewed urgency, ensuring survival, securing what had already begun. There was no celebration, no relief in the traditional sense, only a quiet recognition that something irreversible had just taken place.
Maren saw the child.
For the first time since her sentence, something in her expression changed in a way that could not be mistaken. It was not victory. It was not escape. It was something far more contained and far more powerful, a sense of completion that did not depend on what would happen next. Because what she had set out to do was already done. The aftermath unfolded quickly. Reports were filed. Authorities were notified. Legal frameworks were activated. The existence of the child triggered consequences that no internal investigation could override. The system, which had been focused on control, now had to respond to law in its broader form. Under that law, the presence of a newborn changed everything about Maren's immediate fate. Her sentence could no longer proceed as originally intended. The shift was not emotional. It was procedural. But within that procedure was a recognition the prison could not ignore. The life she had created had altered the outcome of her own. Not by pleading, not by resistance, but by existence alone. Maren did not react to the decision in the way others might have expected. She did not show relief in any outward sense. She did not treat it as a victory. She accepted it with the same quiet control that had defined her from the beginning. Because for her, the purpose had never been to change her sentence. That had only been a consequence. The purpose had been the child. In the days that followed, the prison adjusted around a reality it had never been built to support. Special conditions were implemented. Medical supervision continued. The isolation wing, once silent, now carried a new sound that echoed through its rigid structure. The presence of the infant changed the atmosphere in ways that could not be measured or regulated. Something had softened. Not the rules, not the system, but the space between them. The staff who moved through those corridors now did so with an awareness that had not existed before. The line between control and humanity, once clearly defined, had blurred in a way that no policy could fully restore. Maren remained where she was. She did not ask for more. She did not attempt to reshape her future beyond what had already been decided. She focused entirely on the child, on the brief, contained world that existed within the boundaries of her confinement. Time, which had once been meaningless, now carried weight again, measured not by procedure, but by growth, by presence, by something that would not last forever. Because she understood what the system still held. This was not freedom. It was not redemption. It was time. And time, in a place like that, was the most fragile thing of all. As the weeks passed, the reality settled into something quieter, but no less powerful. The investigation closed, not because every question had been answered, but because the most important one no longer needed to be asked. The prison had learned how it happened. What it could not fully understand was why it had mattered enough for someone to risk everything to make it happen. That answer did not exist in reports. It existed in the child. A life that had begun in the most controlled, restricted environment imaginable, carried forward by a decision that defied logic, law, and expectation. A life that did not belong to the crime, the sentence, or the system that surrounded it. And in the end, that was the only part of the story that remained untouched by everything else. Because no matter what the prison had built, no matter how tightly it had controlled the world inside its walls, it had not been able to stop one thing. Something new had found a way to begin. And that beginning would outlast everything that had tried to contain it.